Hi everyone, my name is Bailey Fisher, and today Alec Bowdry, myself, Dylan Garofalo, and Cole Zessiger will be talking to you guys about the Hancock Building. We are all juniors here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison pursuing various degrees in engineering. Now, I know most of us have heard the tale of the three little pigs and the big bad wolf. The wolf was able to huff and puff and blow two of the houses down. Now this is pretty similar to the situation in Boston, where high winds caused various problems for the building, one which could have possibly been falling over. Now first we will be taking you guys through the various problems the building faced. Then we'll be taking you through the investigation which led to various resolutions. We'll be following that with ethical dilemmas faced by the architects in this case, and we'll analyze the consequences if a firm such as this one does not learn from its mistakes in the future. Simply put, the Hancock Building was an architectural disaster. It was completed in the year 1976, and it remains the tallest building in the Boston skyline. It was designed by the architectural firm I.M. Pei and Partners, which is actually still a well-respected architectural firm to this day. Now, one of the problems this building faced was before it was really even started. Retaining walls were built to allow the building of the foundation. These walls failed, allowing soil to creep in, which caused damage to surrounding sidewalks, roads, and even buildings. According to the Globe, the Trinity Church across the street won an $11.6 million lawsuit to repair damage from this retaining wall failure. Another problem faced was that with high winds, the building would actually sway to a very dangerous degree. There were reports that people on the upper floors would actually suffer from motion sickness. Now, in this picture, you can see the narrow sides, and these narrow sides were a lot less stable than the bigger flat sides. And it was concluded through lab testing that under the correct wind loads, this building could actually fall over. Despite all these problems, the most famous issue is what gave the Hancock its nickname, the Plywood Palace. At high wind speeds, the windows of the building would actually fall out and crash to the ground below. And as you can see in this picture, the building would replace spots where windows once were with plywood, giving it its nickname. It eventually got so bad that police would actually shut down roads around the building when wind speeds reached 45 miles per hour or more. Now, according to Boston.com, the original price of the building was only about $75 million. But with all these problems and all these repairs, the building ended up costing about $175 million.
Hello everyone, my name is Cole Zessiger, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the key players behind the construction of the John Hancock Center in Boston, along with who is responsible for the falling windows that earned the Hancock Center its nickname, the Plywood Palace, and ultimately what was the engineering failure that caused these falling windows. So, first things first, the financer and original resident of the Hancock Center was the John Hancock Life Insurance Company. They reached out to the architect Henry Cobb to design and lead construction on the project. And Henry Cobb is definitely the person who is most responsible for the building's numerous engineering failures. When designing the building, he wanted to build something that was aesthetically pleasing and ahead of its time, and he definitely succeeded in doing this. The Hancock Center is beautiful and stunning to look at. However, it is also an engineering catastrophe. A lot of these failures can be attributed to Henry Cobb trying to design a building that was ahead of its time. Many of the engineering techniques used to construct the Hancock Center had never been used before, and therefore many of the engineering failures that we have seen in this building had never been seen before. I'll go more into detail on the numerous failures that happened in the construction of this building, most specifically the falling windows, on the next slide. So the main failure of the Hancock Center was its falling windows. Essentially, on very windy days, the windows would pop out of their frames and go falling into the streets below. This was such a problem that police had to shut down the roads around the Hancock Center when it was very windy out so that civilians wouldn't get hurt by the falling glass. This was rather embarrassing for the building, and what was even more embarrassing was that when the windows fell out, they would be replaced with sheets of plywood, which earned the building the demeaning nickname of the Plywood Palace. Of course, nowadays, this embarrassing past has all been forgotten. The Hancock Center is regarded by Bostonians as a marvel of architecture and one of the centerpieces of their city. However, it is interesting to think about why this happened, and who was ultimately responsible for the falling windows. So when windows first started falling on the Hancock Center, Henry Cobb was the one who was blamed. People believed that this window failure was due to a flaw in the structure of the building. Essentially, when the Hancock Center was subjected to high winds, it would sway side to side, as Bailey said before, but it would also turn and twist about its axis. This twisting motion, people thought was causing the windows to pop out of their frames and fall to the ground. It wasn't until much later when the true design flaw was realized, which was the windows themselves. These were the first double-layered windows to use reflective glass. Double-layered windows had been used before, but it had not been used with reflective glass. It had only been used with normal glass. And the true flaw of these windows was a thin sheet of lead that was in between the two panes. Essentially, this lead was subjected to mechanical failure, and it would start cracking over time. And when it cracked, it caused the windows to crack as well. And once the windows started cracking, they would break out of their frame and fall to the ground. So the true blame kind of falls on the Libby Owens Ford Glass Manufacturing Company. They're the ones that designed this faulty material. But at the same time, Henry Cobb requested this specific type of reflective glass that had never been used before. As I've said before, Henry Cobb was very into making the Hancock Center ahead of its time and something that was truly spectacular. So by requesting this material that had never been used like this, not on double panes, not on skyscrapers, he was asking for a flaw. He was asking for a mistake. It was the first time it had been used. It's kind of like, okay, well, can't expect the most from it. But at the same time, there's a lot of blame on the glass manufacturers as well. They designed this faulty material, so it is their fault for not truly testing the glass to the degree that they should have.
Hello everyone, my name is Alec Boudry, and I'll be talking about the essential ethical issues and questions surrounding the Hancock Center. So to start off with, how much does grandeur matter if it sacrifices safety? So even in the pre-planning process of the designs for the Hancock Center, there's a lot of skepticism surrounding how much safety or grandeur matters when it comes to sacrificing for safety. Because when they're building, it's a very tall and wide, grand-looking building, but it faces the northeast and southwest in a fashion that when the winds pick up, it catches the winds and it very much acts as almost as a sail. The next problem is how much of these building codes reflect safety. So actually in the process of construction, the building met all safety codes and all building codes, but it evidently is not completely safe. So how much do these codes actually reflect safety in these large skyscraper buildings? And finally, how does a building be built if it negatively affects the structure of the pre-existing building or of the pre-existing buildings around it? So as we talked about before, the Trinity Church right next door to it had some structural problems as soon as the foundation was built for the Hancock Center. So how do we justify sacrificing the structural stability of these other pre-existing buildings to build these grand, large skyscrapers around it? After identifying the central ethical issues, it's important to identify the stresses around these ethical issues. To start off with, we should talk about the need for grandeur, specifically by Hancock Financial. So Hancock Financial is a very large insurance consulting firm where they provide insurance nationwide. And so they actually have a building in Chicago, the Hancock Center, which we know as the Willis Tower now, that was built just 3 years prior to the Hancock Center in Boston. So when they built this huge grand tower in Chicago, they definitely wanted their East Coast branch office to have the same exact grandeur, if not close to it. So that definitely played into why they decided to go with a very grand route instead of thinking more safely and ethically with their building designs. Another stressor around this problem is the public safety. So according to ASCE codes, first and foremost, engineers must protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. This very evidently was not a major concern for the engineers and architects, considering they built this very grand building that's beautiful, but yet it's not completely safe and it's not the best for the people surrounding and inside the building. Finally, to wrap up the ethics of the Hancock Center, I want to talk about the lessons learned. So to start off with, let's talk about the physical changes that were made to the building post-construction. They replaced all the glass panels with glazed and tempered glass panels in order to better prevent from the wind so the glass panels wouldn't break and or fall off during these large storms. The second physical change they made to the building is that they braced the inner core of the building to help prevent from increased sway due to the wide and tall fashion of the building. The second thing that we could learn from this problem is that we need to prevent the damage of pre-existing buildings around these large skyscrapers. And in order to do that, we need to have more advanced and integrated soil property analysis be done. This includes property analysis on the strength of the soil, the hydraulic conductivity of the soil, and the compressibility of the soil, as these are the three main parts of soil properties that actually deem whether soil is good to be building on and if it's safe to build on. And finally, the last lesson learned is that these building codes must be exceeded and not met. As I stated previously, during construction, the building met all codes that needed to be met to actually be built, but yet this is evidently not enough to keep the building safe for the public and the people inside. So we need to make sure that when we meet these codes, we not only get to what is needed to have the building be built, but to exceed these expectations and make sure for absolute fact that we are going to have a safe and ethical building for everybody around and inside the building.
Now we are going to be talking about analyzing the risk associated with engineering and ethical failures such as the Hancock Center. Specifically, financial and social risk are among the most important, as well as some additional concerns brought up during analysis. Failing to prevent another incident like this could result in injuries and deaths, as well as delays in construction completion times. Both of these issues can cost companies millions of dollars, whether it be lawsuits from negligence or increased operational costs from additional man-hours. Also, there are additional materials and designs to be considered, because when issues arise, they must be fixed, and they often require extra materials and additional designs from additional engineers. All of these issues come from improper design and the failure to learn from past errors such as the Hancock Center, and can really reduce a company's ability to stay profitable. Social risks are an additional issue that we must analyze when talking about engineering and ethical failures such as the Hancock Center. If other incidents similar to the Hancock Center did occur, people around the building could be injured from falling windows. There would be a huge fallout with the construction company potentially being considered dangerous to the public due to their faulty designs. There would be widespread social fallout with people urging customers to go elsewhere due to the bad reputation garnered from the poor dealings with past projects. The effect on the company's ability to perform well in the economy is also heavily affected by a popularly held view of the company on social media. After analysis of both social and financial risks, we now come to some additional issues that arise during analysis of these engineering and ethical failures. The first is to discuss an engineering firm's long-term outlook. Companies would certainly increase their revenue in the long term by examining these failures and preventing them in the future. They would not be trying to play catch-up on projects or pay out to costly lawsuits from victims of their poor engineering. Additionally, the company would certainly have diminished long-term prospects if these ethical issues were just ignored. The company's actual expenditures would certainly increase as these issues surfaced and were subsequently fixed, with additional hours of operation and materials. All of these factors would diminish their bottom line, and if a company cannot make money, then it is doomed to fail. Additionally, those who are most affected would not even be the engineers who designed the building, but the customers and personnel in the building. In the event of a collapse or other malfunction, there is a possibility of injuries or even deaths occurring, which with good engineering practices could have been avoided. In conclusion, the Hancock Center represents an ethical dilemma in engineering, where plans were not properly designed. This led to a disaster where people could have been hurt by falling windows or a partial building collapse. Money and time of both the customer and the company were wasted in the process of fixing the poor designs. The importance of designing not just for aesthetics, but also critically examining the designs you have created to make sure they are safe and effective for those who use our projects cannot be overstated. I'd like to thank you everyone for listening and ask if there are any questions at this time.